The courthouse was unusually quiet that morning. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from respect. It was the kind that crackled electric, tense, uncertain. Even the murmurs from reporters seated in the back row faded as the double oak. Doors creaked open, and a little girl stepped through. She was smaller than anyone expected. Just 6 years old, with large, searching eyes and curls that peeked from under a faded pink hood. Her name wasn't released to the public, Emily. The court called her for privacy. She clung to a worn stuffed bear in one hand, her guardian's jacket sleeve in the other. The courtroom, filled with judges, lawyers, media, and an invisible storm of expectation, seemed to close in around her. She didn't speak. Not a word. Not even a nod. And yet, everyone leaned forward as if the air itself hung on what she might do. At the front, Judge Carolyn Briggs, a woman with 30 years of judicial experience, watched Emily intently. Beside the bench, the defense attorney, sleek in his tailored suit, wore a smirk that suggested this would be another empty session. Another failed attempt. Another day when the girl said nothing, and the charges would begin to weaken with time. Sitting off to the side, near the witness stand, was Rex. He was a K-9 unit, a broad-shouldered German shepherd with deep, almost human eyes. His badge hung from his collar, and his head rested calmly on his front paws. He looked less like a police dog, and more like a sentinel, silent, watchful, and present. Emily noticed him the moment she entered. Her steps faltered. The bailiff motioned her forward, but she didn't look at him. She didn't look at the judge, the jury, or the man on the defense bench. She looked at Rex. And then something shifted. Emily let go of her guardian's sleeve and walked one tiny, deliberate step at a time toward the witness chair. Not because she was told to, not because she was forced, but because he was there. Rex. As she passed him, she paused. The stuffed bear dropped from her hand, unnoticed. Her fingers reached out and touched Rex gently behind the ear. The dog didn't move, but his tail gave one slow wag, a silent acknowledgement. That was the first touch of the day. The second came when she climbed onto the tall wooden chair and tucked her legs beneath her, hugging them tightly. She looked nervous, yes, but also ready. The judge leaned in slightly. "Emily," she said softly, "do you remember what we talked about? You're safe here. You don't have to be afraid." No response. The prosecutor, a patient woman named Dana, stood slowly. "Emily," she said gently, "can you tell us? Do you remember what happened the night the police came to your house?" Nothing. The court held its breath. Somewhere in the gallery, a camera clicked. The defense lawyer sighed dramatically. But Emily turned. She looked at Rex. And she pointed. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it echoed like a thunderclap. "He saw everything too." Gasps. A chair scraped back. The court stenographer froze for a second before regaining composure. The judge blinked in shock. The defense attorney stood up to object, but the judge raised a hand sharply. Silence. Emily wasn't finished. Her eyes stayed on Rex. "He was there after, when I was scared. When they took Mommy away, he didn't leave me." No one moved. It wasn't just the words. It was the truth in them. The pure, undistilled honesty that could only come from a child. Her words didn't name the attacker. They didn't give a play-by-play. But they opened the door. A door that had remained closed by trauma, fear, and silence for months. That door was now cracked open, and nothing would be the same after that moment. The judge leaned back in her chair slowly, realization dawning in her eyes. The child hadn't spoken for nearly a year, but today she had chosen to speak, and she chose to speak through the dog, because Rex was more than comfort. He was witness, protector, and truth-bearer in the eyes of a child. Then the stillness that followed. Rex stood up slowly and moved to Emily's side, sitting tall beside the witness chair. He didn't bark. He didn't flinch. He simply sat beside her, quiet, grounded, loyal, just like he had the night it all began, long before the courtroom, before the silence, before the dog. There was only fear. It happened on a Friday night in late October, just days before Emily's 7th birthday. Her mother, Clara, had decorated their small apartment with paper pumpkins and streamers, hopeful they could have a party, even if money was tight. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, still wearing her school uniform, cradling the same stuffed bear she'd later carry into court. But the knock on the door came after midnight, loud, repetitive, demanding. Emily's mother opened the door cautiously, only to be shoved backward by a man who shouldn't have been there. Marcus Holley. A name whispered in town with weight and hesitation. A man with ties to law enforcement, real estate, and campaign donors. A man who could get away with a lot. Until he didn't. Know. One knew the full nature of his relationship with Clara. Some said he had helped her with rent in the past. Others believed he had promised her protection. Whatever their arrangement was, that night it came crashing down. He was drunk, angry, possessive, and something had pushed him over the edge. Emily awoke to shouting, then to a sound she would never forget, her mother crying out. She didn't move. Her instinct was to stay still, small, unseen. From her position on the couch, she could see Marcus grabbing her mother's arm, dragging her toward the kitchen. Clara tried to fight. She screamed again. A glass shattered. Then silence. And then Emily screamed. It wasn't a loud, clear scream like in the movies. It was hoarse, terrified, pure. It came from the pit of her stomach, cutting through the apartment like a siren. It was that sound the neighbor heard. That sound that brought the police. That sound that saved both their lives. When the first officers arrived, Marcus tried to play it cool, claimed it was a misunderstanding. But Clara's bruises told another story. And Emily? She hadn't spoken a word. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not for weeks. Child Protective Services were called immediately. Clara was hospitalized. Marcus was arrested, but released on bail, thanks to his connections. The fear that he could return was real, palpable. And so, Emily was placed in protective custody while the case built. Trauma therapists tried everything: play therapy, drawing, even music. But Emily had locked herself in a silent world where words were unsafe. Until one day, in a gray-carpeted office at the edge of town, someone brought in a dog. Not just any dog, Rex, the canine unit from the local police department. He wasn't there for therapy. He had simply been brought along to meet the kids during a community visit. But the moment Emily saw him, something shifted. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She crawled toward him, sat cross-legged beside him, and began stroking his fur. She didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. For the first time since that night, she looked calm. The handlers were stunned. When Rex laid down and rolled onto his side, a sign of complete trust, Emily smiled. That smile was the beginning. Over the weeks that followed, she began spending more time with him, sitting beside him during sessions, feeding him treats, whispering things only he heard. Sometimes she'd nod if a therapist asked a question. Once she giggled when Rex sneezed unexpectedly. It wasn't progress in a traditional sense, but it was a lifeline. Not so. When the court date loomed, and everyone was still unsure if Emily could testify, her therapist made a bold suggestion. Let her bring Rex. It seemed absurd. Courtrooms weren't daycare centers, but the legal team fought hard. They knew the stakes. Clara had recovered enough to testify herself, but without Emily, there was still doubt. Without the child's voice, Marcus Hale's lawyers could twist the narrative, and so, against precedent, but in the spirit of justice, the judge agreed. That's how, On a cold morning in February, Emily walked past cameras and strangers, into the courtroom, not alone but with Rex, waiting beside the witness stand. Not a word had been spoken yet, but something had already changed. It was an argument that stretched late into the evening. Courtroom 4A had never seen anything like it. A team of lawyers, child psychologists, and police officers passionately defending the presence of a dog in a court of law, not as evidence, but as emotional support for the most crucial witness in a case that had shaken the community. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor said, placing a trembling hand on a folder filled with therapy reports. "This child hasn't spoken to a human being about that night in almost a year. But she has spoken, just not in the way we're used to. Through this dog, she expresses more than words. He's her stability." The judge, known for her no-nonsense attitude and strict adherence to protocol, adjusted her glasses and studied the reports. Her chambers were quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock. Finally, she looked up and said, "If the child feels safe with the animal present, I'll allow it. But under strict supervision, no disruptions." With that single decision, history began to shift, not just for Emily, but for trauma-informed court procedures everywhere. Word spread quickly. By the morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were littered with journalists. Flashbulbs popped as police officers escorted Officer Rex, wearing a vest labeled "In Training, Therapy Support Unit," through the crowd. He moved confidently, oblivious to the headlines he'd soon inspire. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Everyone watched as Emily entered, timid but less hesitant than before. She wasn't holding her guardian's hand this time. She walked ahead, eyes locked on Rex, who was already seated beside the witness box. The moment their eyes met, her face softened. She dropped her stuffed bear near the base of the stand and crouched beside Rex. One hand reached out to stroke his back in slow, calming motions. He leaned into her, offering silent comfort, just as he'd done during their sessions. The court held its collective breath. Was this going to work? The judge gave a nod. The prosecutor approached slowly. "Emily," she said in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, "do you remember what happened the night your mommy got hurt?" A beat of silence. 2.3. Then Emily did something no one expected. She stood up, barely tall enough to reach the edge of the wooden stand. She turned slightly, pointed to Rex, and said, "He saw everything too." Gasps rippled through the room. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, unsure whether it was a disruption or a declaration. The judge raised her hand to hold the moment still. "Let her speak," she said firmly. Emily didn't look at the judge or the attorneys. She kept her eyes on Rex, her hand still resting on his fur. "When the bad man came, I was on the couch. Mommy screamed. I closed my eyes, but I heard it. I didn't want to look, but I saw his hand." The words weren't fluent or polished, but they were honest. Each sentence delivered with the trembling bravery of a child finding her voice in a sea of strangers. The defense lawyer rose. "Objection. This is clearly coached. She's speaking to a dog." The judge shook her head. "She's testifying, in her way." Emily looked at the defense attorney, and then down again. "I remember his shoes," she said quietly. "He wore brown ones with gold buckles. I saw them standing on Mommy's necklace. He broke it." The court froze. It was a detail no one had released, not to the media, not even to the mother. The broken necklace had been found under the kitchen table. The judge's eyes widened. Emily's testimony wasn't imaginary. It was real. And the dog, sitting silently at her side, was the thread connecting her trauma to her truth. Not barking, not growling. Just being. The bond between a child and a dog had opened the first crack in a case built on silence and fear. And now, the truth had begun to pour through. For a moment, The courtroom didn't breathe. Emily's words, "He saw everything too," still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Spoken softly, almost innocently, they cut through the layers of legal argument, trauma, and procedural doubt with the rawness only a child could deliver. The prosecutor stood frozen. Her pen paused above her notepad. The defense lawyer adjusted. His tie, suddenly looking far less smug than he had 10 minutes before. And Rex? Rex didn't move. His chest rose slowly as he sat at Emily's side, stoic and still. His dark eyes flicked toward her for just a second, as if acknowledging the weight of what she had done. Or maybe, in his own quiet way, thanking her for the trust. The judge leaned forward. "Emily, can you tell us who the man was?" Emily hesitated. Her hand moved slowly to touch Rex's collar. She traced the metal badge with her fingertip, then whispered, "He yelled at Mommy. He grabbed her shirt. She cried. I saw the wine bottle fall." Her eyes stayed on the dog. "I didn't like his voice. It sounded like breaking things." "Eh?" Murmur rolled through the courtroom. Her words weren't neat or precise, but they were real, vivid, undeniable. She wasn't repeating things she'd overheard. She wasn't guessing. She was remembering, in her own way, and she was doing it because Rex was there. The defense rose quickly. "Objection. This is unfiltered, unsupported testimony based on emotional projection. She's speaking to the dog, not the court. This should be struck from the record." The judge turned to him sharply. "She's speaking through the dog. There's a difference." She looked back at Emily. "Sweetheart, do you remember what the man looked like?" Emily nodded. "He had mean eyes, and he smelled like Daddy used to smell when he drank too much." Her voice wavered. "And his shoes were shiny. I saw them in the light when Mommy fell." Again the shoes. The gold-buckled leather shoes, found in Marcus Hale's closet during the arrest. Now it wasn't just emotional testimony. It was corroborated detail. Marcus Hall, seated next to his defense team, shifted in his chair. The color in his face drained slightly, and he leaned toward his lawyer, whispering urgently. But the damage was done. Emily, who hadn't uttered a full sentence in nearly a year, had connected dots the prosecution struggled to link together. And she had done it all while holding the ear of a dog. Rex let out a slow, audible exhale, almost like a sigh. The room was still. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, who gave a small nod to proceed. "Emily," the prosecutor said softly, "how do you feel when Rex is with you?" The little girl looked down at the dog and smiled faintly. "He listens. He doesn't make me say things I don't want to. But he remembers with me." She paused. "He was there when I was alone. And he's still here." A tear slipped down the face of the social worker seated near the front row. This wasn't just a courtroom victory in the making. It was a human moment. One the jury couldn't ignore. One they wouldn't forget. The judge leaned back in her chair and looked across the courtroom. "Let the record show that the child has given emotionally coherent, detail-specific testimony. Cross-examination may proceed in due time." The defense attorney sat down slowly. He didn't speak. What could he say? Emily looked up at the judge, then down at her bear lying at the foot of the stand. She slid off her chair, picked it up, and whispered something into its ear. Then, still holding Rex's leash loosely in one hand, she said, "Can I go now?" The judge smiled, something rare and maternal. "Yes, Emily, you did very well." As the child walked back toward her guardian, Rex padding gently beside her, there was no applause. No dramatic music. Just a room filled with people forever changed by a girl who found her voice, not with a microphone or a therapist, but with a dog who simply listened. A whisper had shaken the walls of Justice Dot, and the ripple had only just begun. The courtroom emptied slowly. But no one left unchanged. What had just happened felt larger than a single testimony. Emily's voice, fragile yet clear, cracked something wide open, something that neither expert witnesses nor forensic photos had managed to do. People stood in the aisles, murmuring. Reporters typed furiously, already tweeting lines like, "Child breaks silence by pointing to police dog. He saw everything too." Prosecution gained surprise momentum in Hawley case after powerful child testimony. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up, tossing leaves along the steps where journalists now gathered in clusters, narrating the emotional turn of events to every local and national station that showed up. Microphones swung toward the exit like hunting dogs, picking up a scent. But Emily didn't come out that way. She was quietly escorted through a side entrance, shielded by her guardian, a social worker, and of course Rex. Back inside, Judge Briggs remained seated longer than usual, staring down at her bench. All her years on the bench, she had never seen such an unorthodox moment unfold so perfectly. Emily hadn't just identified her abuser. She had disarmed the courtroom with truth delivered in the gentlest voice imaginable. And that terrified the defense. Behind closed doors, Marcus Hale's lawyers were unraveling. "This isn't solid testimony," his lead attorney snapped. "We can argue emotional manipulation, unqualified witness, therapy contamination." "But she described the shoes," another whispered. "No one knew about the necklace or the shoes." "She's 6, the lead shot back. "We can shake her and cross." But deep down, even they knew, you can't shake someone who's not talking to you. Emily had spoken to the dog, to herself, to the memory. And that was far harder to dismantle than a direct statement to a hostile room. Meanwhile, Emily sat curled on the couch inside a protected office within the courthouse. She wasn't crying. She wasn't talking either, but she was smiling, just a little as Rex rested his head in her lap. Her guardian looked at the social worker, who was quietly wiping her eyes. "What happens now?" the guardian asked. "We pray the jury saw what we saw," the woman whispered. "Because if they didn't, then we failed her twice." Across town, news channels began looping her testimony. Legal experts debated its admissibility. Trauma specialists praised the courtroom's allowance of therapeutic aid. Pet advocates applauded Rex's presence. And a nationwide audience watched a video clip of a little girl pointing to a dog and saying 6 words that felt like a novel. "He saw everything too." Those words reached more than courtroom walls. They reached the mayor's office, the state bar, the district attorney's headquarters, and dozens of advocacy groups. For some, it was heartwarming. For others, it was damning, especially those with something to lose if Marcus Hawley fell from grace. That evening, Clara, Emily's mother, watched the clip on a borrowed phone in her temporary housing facility. She had no idea her daughter would speak, let alone speak so powerfully. Tears streamed down her face. "She's stronger than I ever knew," she whispered to no one in particular. She wasn't wrong. Emily had done what few adults could have. She had stood up in her own way and lit a fire beneath a system that often froze when it came to protecting the vulnerable. The next morning, courtroom seats were filled even earlier. The defense was expected to cross-examine, but now they had to strategize differently because Emily had already done something far more powerful than provide evidence. She had become believable. And in the eyes of a jury, a believable child with nothing to gain and no reason to lie is often the most powerful force in the room, especially when she's backed by a silent witness with 4 legs, a wagging tail, and the patience to let truth unfold at its own fragile pace. The courtroom was quiet again, but this time not from tension. It was from absorption. Emily's testimony, simple and strange to some, had changed the tone of the trial. Yet to others, particularly the defense, it was still vulnerable to attack. She talked to a dog, the defense attorney said, almost scoffing as he paced the floor. Not to the court. Not to the jury. This is emotion, not evidence. But the prosecution had anticipated this. Their next move wasn't emotional. It was clinical. Dr. Miriam Adler, a respected child trauma psychologist, was called to the stand. She had reviewed Emily's sessions, therapy transcripts, and had even observed her interactions with Rex in person. She was calm, clear, and terrifyingly precise. Emily's behavior is consistent with post-traumatic selective mutism. Dr. Adler began. It's not uncommon in children exposed to acute violence. Her silence isn't stubbornness or manipulation, it's self-protection. And the dog? The defense asked sharply. Dr. Adler smiled politely, unbothered by the tone. Rex is a therapeutic anchor. Emily doesn't just see him as safe, she's transferred her internal memory through him. Children who experience trauma often use play, animals, or inanimate objects to communicate because it distances them from reliving the event. So you're saying she's inventing a story to tell through the dog? No, Adler replied calmly. I'm saying she told the truth. And her method is what makes it believable. She didn't script anything. She recalled sensory details, sound, smell, sight that she could only have known if she were present. That stopped the defense cold. The prosecutor followed up. In your expert opinion, is Emily's testimony credible? Adler didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. Her use of the phrase "he saw everything too" is not fantasy. It's projection, one of the clearest forms of safe disclosure in young children. The jury scribbled notes. One juror, a mother of three, nodded softly to herself. Next, the court heard from Sergeant Hawley, Rex's handler and the K-9 unit supervisor. He explained that Rex had been trained not just for drug detection and suspect apprehension, but also victim support. When we introduced Rex to community outreach work, we never expected him to connect like this. But with Emily, something clicked, he said. How so? The prosecutor asked. She never looked anyone in the eye. Wouldn't speak. But with Rex, she touched him, whispered to him, drew pictures of him standing next to her during the attack. Sometimes she'd cry, then hug him. That dog was the first living thing she trusted after it all. The courtroom sat still again, not from spectacle, but from understanding. The science, the behavior, the emotion, it was all beginning to align. The defense tried to push back. They argued that no one could verify the dog saw anything, that no K-9 could testify, that the jury was being manipulated by sentimentality. But that argument didn't land the way they hoped, because no one was asking Rex to testify. Emily already had, and her testimony, all spoken through soft words and K-9 connection, had shown more truth than the polished alibis of her abuser. Outside the courthouse, the story exploded. Headlines flooded with phrases like, "Experts validate child's K-9-based testimony as legally grounded. K-9 comfort unit sparks legal debate after breakthrough in abuse trial. News vans stayed parked overnight." Advocacy groups began filing amicus briefs. Social media trended with hashtags like #JusticeForEmily and #RexTheWitness. Inside the courtroom, a storm was building, but not the one Marcus Hawley had expected. His carefully polished reputation, his network of favors, his years of hiding behind money and status, it was all unraveling. Not because of evidence bags or fingerprints, but because a 6-year-old girl pointed to a dog and told the world. He saw everything too. And now, with experts validating her every word, the defense couldn't dismiss her. They could only fear what came next. The truth was no longer silent. It was loud, undeniable, and it had teeth. The courtroom was tense like never before. After the expert witnesses and the undeniable bond between Emily and Rex, The defense knew they had to do something drastic. They could not let the jury see this child as a reliable witness, not when their client's freedom was on the line. Marcus, Hale's lead attorney, took the floor with a calculated calmness that masked the desperation beneath. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began smoothly, "what you have heard today is not a direct testimony. It is filtered through a child who has been coached not just by therapy or well-meaning officers, but by an animal. This dog cannot swear to the facts, cannot remember the details, and is not an eyewitness." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The defense lawyer saw the chance to sway the crowd and pressed harder. "Miss Emily's story has changed throughout this trial. First silence, then a few words, and now a whole narrative supported only by a pet's presence. How can we trust memories told this way?" Emily sat quietly on the witness stand, Rex lying calmly at her feet. Her guardian's hand gripped hers tightly, sensing the coming storm. The defense called in a child psychologist of their own, a man who painted a picture of false memory syndrome and suggestibility in young children, claiming Emily's testimony was shaped by external influences. "It's possible the child is repeating phrases she's heard, reacting to what adults want to hear," he said. "And Rex, the dog, serves as a comfort, but not as a conduit of truth." The judge allowed the testimony, but the room felt a heavy silence afterward, weighed down by the discomfort of manipulating a child's trauma for legal gains. Outside the courthouse, the community was watching closely. Local activists gathered at the steps, holding signs that read, "Protect our children, believe survivors. Justice for Emily and Rex." Clara, Emily's mother, had been invited to speak at one of the rallies. Her voice trembled as she addressed the crowd. "My daughter was silenced by fear for so long. But when she found Rex, she found a way to speak that fear aloud. To deny her voice now is to deny every child who has suffered in silence." Her words echoed through the crowd, igniting fresh energy and compassion. Meanwhile, Emily's guardian stayed by her side constantly, helping her navigate the difficult emotions. The courtroom battles were draining. "Do you want to keep going?" the guardian asked one afternoon as they prepared for another day. Emily looked up at Rex, who wagged his tail softly. She nodded. Because the dog wasn't just a witness, he was a lifeline. The defense tried their hardest to shake the jury's faith, but Emily's courage, combined with the expert testimony and undeniable detail, kept the scales tipping toward justice. And behind the scenes, prosecutors were preparing the final pieces of their case. The story was no longer just about a child and a dog. It was about a system, struggling to hear the voices of the most vulnerable. A system learning that sometimes truth comes wrapped in fur and silence. The courtroom was packed once again on the day of closing arguments. The air was thick with anticipation. Months of silence, tears, fear, and hope had led to this moment. Every person in the room seemed to hold their breath. Emily sat quietly beside Rex, her little hand wrapped around his leash. She was still small, still fragile, but now she carried an unshakable strength, a strength born from the courage to speak her truth. The prosecutor rose. First, her voice steady and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard a testimony unlike any other. A child too frightened to speak for so long found her voice, not with words alone, but through the steadfast presence of a dog named Rex. Through him, Emily shared details only the attacker would know." She paused, looking directly at the jury. "This case is not just about evidence, it's about trust. Trust that this little girl is telling the truth in the only way she knows how. And the truth is clear. Marcus Hale hurt her mother. He broke their lives." The defense attorney stood to deliver his final words, his voice desperate but measured. "You've heard emotional stories and expert opinions, but remember, this is a court of law. Evidence must be concrete. This case rests on the fragile memories of a child speaking through a dog. Are you willing to convict on that alone? But the jury's faces told a different story. Months of listening, watching, and feeling had built something stronger than doubt. The judge gave her final instructions. The jurors filed out, whispers filling the room as the tension grew unbearable. Emily's guardian knelt beside her. "You did wonderfully," she said softly. Emily smiled shyly, fingers twitching around Rex's collar. Hours later, the courtroom doors reopened. The jury returned, foreperson holding a folded paper. The room fell silent. "We find the defendant guilty." The voice rang out. A gasp spread through the room. Marcus Hale's shoulders slumped, his lawyer's face pale. But Emily? She looked at Rex, her silent hero, and smiled. Outside, the news crews flooded in. Reporters called it a landmark moment, justice for a child who had once been voiceless. The community gathered to celebrate, rallying around Emily and her family. The mayor announced plans to fund therapy programs and support animals in courts nationwide. Clara, Emily's mother, embraced her daughter. "You showed us all what courage means," she whispered. Emily's story didn't just end in that courtroom. It changed the way justice was seen and served. It proved that sometimes the loudest truths come through quiet voices, and that healing can come on four paws. And as Rex sat loyally by Emily's side, wagging his tail, it was clear this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where every child could find their voice, no matter how scared or small.